My name is Harriet Voss. I'm 63, widowed, and I've spent most of the past decade learning how to keep my life together on my own one carefully measured day at a time. Some mornings, I wake up and feel the weight of the silence in my small Savannah apartment as if it's pressing down on my chest. Today was one of those mornings, and it didn't take long for the quiet to break. The phone rang sharp and insistent, slicing through the soft hum of the ceiling fan. I didn't need to look at the caller ID. I knew who it was. Madison, my daughter-in-law. Every month, like clockwork, her calls arrived with a single purpose: to remind me that my own money, what I'd earned and saved through years of careful planning, was not enough. Not in her eyes. "I'm coming for the money tonight," she said, and the words came out as if they were snapping with the force of a whip. There was no warmth in her voice, only urgency and a sharp edge that left my stomach in knots. My hands trembled slightly as I held the phone, gripping it as though it might slip through my fingers and shatter. I swallowed hard, trying to steady the rush of panic rising in my chest. I'll have it ready," I said, my voice tighter than I intended. Even saying the words felt like swallowing stones. Madison's laugh was short, almost cruel. "You better. Don't try anything funny, Harriet. You know I mean it." The line went dead, and I was left staring at the phone as if it had betrayed me somehow. My chest felt heavy, each breath shallow. I set the phone on the counter, my fingers lingering on the cool plastic. The apartment around me seemed to contract. The sunlight coming through the blinds looked harsh, almost accusatory. Oliver, my white cat with the black smudges across his fur, leapt onto my lap, curling against my trembling hands. I stroked him slowly, seeking any comfort I could find. At least someone depended on me for calm, if only him. Outside, the streets of Savannah were quiet, the moss-draped trees swaying gently in the morning breeze, a peaceful contrast to the storm inside my mind. I walked over to the window, watching the familiar cobblestone streets, imagining Madison striding toward my apartment with that familiar intensity in her stride. How had it come to this? When did my own son's family become a source of fear rather than love? The question lingered unanswered as I felt the familiar knot in my stomach tighten further. The day stretched ahead of me, an endless prelude to the confrontation I knew was coming tonight. I tried to focus on small things, washing the dishes, checking the mail, but every sound made me jump. Every shadow on the wall whispered her name. The tension settled into my bones, a dull ache that wouldn't let go. By the time the afternoon sunlight reached the living room, I had resigned myself to it. Tonight, Madison would come, and tonight, I would face her. I didn't yet know how, but I knew I had to. Before I became Harriet Voss, the woman who trembled at the thought of a single phone call, I was the mother who learned early how to stretch $1 until it groaned. I remember mornings when I would wake before sunrise, lacing up my scuffed work shoes and slipping quietly out of our small apartment in Savannah. The offices I cleaned were still dark, the air heavy with dust and the faint scent of old paper. But I moved quickly, methodically scrubbing desks, wiping counters, making sure everything gleamed. I could hear the faint rustle of my son Daniel in his crib as I slipped out, and that small sound pushed me forward, kept me moving even when my body ached and my hands were raw from cleaning solutions. After the office floors were polished and the trash emptied, I would rush home long enough to shower, change, and then head to the diner where I worked nights. The fluorescent lights buzzed, the trays clattered, and the orders flew like sparks from a fire. I balanced plates and poured coffee with hands that refused to stop, all the while imagining Daniel's little face waiting for me at home. I served strangers with smiles that I didn't feel, trading my exhaustion for the coins and tips that would ensure he had food on the table and warmth in his small bed. Even with my exhaustion, I clung to the rituals that kept our lives tethered to some semblance of normalcy. Thanksgiving was the sacredest of these. I would wake hours before the sun, stuffing a whole chicken with herbs, peeling potatoes, until my fingers ached, and stirring pumpkin pie, filling with careful precision. Daniel would toddle around the kitchen, sticky fingers and laughter, and I would watch him and think that no matter how little we had, he would always have these moments. There were nights I would fall into bed with the smell of roasted poultry and sugar still clinging to my clothes, my body shaking with fatigue and relief. I never thought of myself as heroic, just necessary. Each plate I scrubbed, each order I served, each pie I baked was a thread in the fabric of Daniel's survival. And somehow, despite the exhaustion and the lonely nights, I carried a stubborn pride. I thought often about the sacrifices, the hours spent in a world that never acknowledged my labor, the empty stomachs I ignored until I returned home. Yet every night, when I held Daniel close, I felt the warmth of purpose, even if it came with the weight of my own deprivation. My hands bore the calluses of necessity, and my back ached with the memory of countless shifts. But there was love stitched into every ache, every bruise, every skipped meal. Those early years, I realized, had prepared me for moments like this, the tension of an impending confrontation, the fear of threats, and the need to stand firm. They had taught me endurance, patience, and most importantly, that love could survive even the harshest deprivation. I had learned to give to sacrifice and to hope that my efforts would shield the one I loved most from harm, hunger, and cold. As the sunlight dipped lower through the blinds of my living room, I traced my fingers along the edges of the worn wooden table, imagining the smells of roast chicken and pumpkin pie and Daniel's laughter echoing through the apartment. Those memories weren't just nostalgia. They were armor reminders of what I had endured and what I had built with nothing but determination. And tonight, I would need every ounce of that resilience. Even in the midst of exhaustion, there were moments when Daniel's laughter filled the apartment and made the world feel temporarily lighter. I can still see him, a small boy with wide brown eyes, sitting at the tiny kitchen table, while I stirred a pot of gravy, his knees swinging and his fingers smearing pancake batter across the edge of the plate. He would lean forward, eyes shining with anticipation, and ask the same question, over and over. "Is it ready yet, Mom?" I'd smile through the fatigue, letting him inch closer, telling him stories about the food on the stove as if it were magic. The pumpkin pie wasn't just a dessert, it was a story of orange sunlight, cinnamon dusted like fairy dust, and the warmth of our tiny home. Every bite brought him joy. Every clumsy attempt at stirring or kneading dough made me laugh in spite of my sore muscles and aching back. Those moments felt like small rebellions against the hardship that defined our daily lives. Daniel loved the little traditions I tried to maintain. Every Friday night, we'd build blanket forts in the living room, hiding beneath quilts, eating popcorn, and sharing stories of imaginary worlds where monsters were scared of little boys and mothers held magical powers. He never noticed that my hands were calloused, that the hours spent cleaning offices or waiting tables had left me weary. To him, I was simply the storyteller, the cook, the guardian of all things warm and safe. I remember his excitement on Saturdays when I would let him help with breakfast. He would crack eggs with exaggerated care, spill flour across the counter, and beam with pride when the pancakes didn't burn. Even in the small chaos, there was a rhythm, a silent understanding that love could be measured not in dollars or comfort, but in attention, patience, and presence. Sometimes I would watch him fall asleep on the couch, crumbs still on his cheek, a half-read storybook in his hand, and feel a quiet surge of relief. All the struggles, the exhaustion, the long hours, the constant worry felt justified in that moment. His joy was a shield, a bright light I could carry through the darkness of sleepless nights and unpaid bills. Those small moments of happiness reminded me why I endured so much. I had built a sanctuary, however imperfect, where Daniel could grow unburdened by my fears. His laughter, his wide-eyed wonder at my cooking, the rituals we shared, these were the victories I kept close to my heart, quiet but enduring. Even now, thinking back, those memories give me strength. They are reminders that resilience isn't always loud. It can live in the small acts of love, the patient weaving of traditions, and the careful tending of a child's wonder. Daniel's joy was never mine to claim, yet in nurturing it, I found a deep reservoir of courage I would call upon for the challenges yet to come. I stepped outside into the warm afternoon, the air carrying the faint scent of salt from the nearby river and the earthy aroma of moss-laden oak trees. Savannah's cobblestone streets stretched out before me, familiar yet strangely distant, lined with pastel-colored homes whose shutters rattled softly in the breeze. Walking through this historic neighborhood was like moving through the chapters of my own life. Each house, each street lamp, each rusted mailbox, a memory waiting to be stirred. Mrs. Calhoun, my elderly neighbor, was tending her garden, her hands gnarled but steady as she pruned the azaleas. She gave me a nod, and I returned it with a faint smile. In another era, we would have chatted, shared tea, or gossip. But now the words felt heavy with distance, as if the rhythm of our days had been interrupted long before tonight. I noticed the old playground at the corner swings creaking in the wind. Daniel used to race me there, his laughter echoing across the empty streets, bouncing off the brick facades. I remembered the small, scraped knees, the sticky hands from ice cream cones, and the way his eyes sparkled when he accomplished the simplest of feats. That boy, then so fearless, so full of wonder, was still alive in my memory. A beacon I clung to in moments of unease. Passing the bakery, I caught a whiff of freshly baked bread and pecan pie. For a brief moment, the heaviness in my chest eased, replaced by warmth and nostalgia. I thought of the quiet mornings when Daniel and I would sit at our tiny kitchen table, stealing bites of cinnamon rolls before school. Those moments of calm, of ordinary happiness, had been my fortress in a life otherwise marked by struggle and constant vigilance. A group of children ran past, chasing a ball down the street. I watched them, feeling both envy and admiration. Their freedom, their joy. It was something I had fought to preserve for Daniel, even at the cost of my own rest, comfort, and at times sanity. Now, as I walked these familiar streets, each step seemed weighted with anticipation, a prelude to the confrontation I could sense drawing nearer with every passing hour. I paused at the corner near my old church, the steeple catching the sunlight, casting long shadows across the brick sidewalk. Here, Daniel had learned to sing in the choir, his small voice lifting with certainty that I had never possessed in the world of adults and responsibilities. I touched the railing, feeling the rough iron under my fingers, a tactile reminder that endurance often came from the strength one could draw from memory, from roots planted long ago. The shadows lengthened as I continued down the street. The sidewalks quiet now, the distant hum of traffic like a muted heartbeat. I knew that tonight would require more than nostalgia or longing. It would demand courage, precision, and an unshakable resolve. Yet walking here, surrounded by echoes of laughter and the quiet dignity of this old city, I felt a fragile kindling of strength. Savannah had seen centuries of storms of people rising and falling, yet the streets endured. Perhaps I thought so could I. Back inside my apartment, the walls seemed closer than they had this morning, each corner pressing in as if the space itself could sense the storm approaching. My chest felt tight, and my heartbeat drummed loud enough that I feared it might echo through the empty rooms. I moved mechanically, putting away the male straightening cushions, but nothing I did seemed to calm the storm coiling in my stomach. I had tried to eat lunch a simple sandwich, but my appetite had vanished the moment Madison's voice rang in my head. The bread sat on the plate untouched, a reminder that fear could rob the body as easily as it did the spirit. I sipped lukewarm tea, stirring absent-mindedly, and glanced at Oliver, my white cat with black smudges across his fur. He had settled on the windowsill tail, flicking in quiet judgment, as if he understood more than I could admit about the tension suffocating our little home. I walked through the apartment, touching surfaces, adjusting trinkets on the shelves, as if these small rituals could impose order on the chaos in my mind. Each step was measured, deliberate, a silent rehearsal for the confrontation I knew would come. The curtains swayed lightly with the breeze from the open window shadows, dancing across the hardwood floor like warnings. I shivered, not from cold, but from the anticipation and the weight of what was coming. I remembered the mornings years ago when Daniel would climb onto my lap for breakfast, eager to hear the stories I told as I prepared his oatmeal. Then, as now, I had carried the burden of keeping him safe, fed, and warm, even when my own body ached with fatigue. That same sense of responsibility now tightened my chest, mixed with the dread that I could fail to protect myself from the adult threats lurking at my door. Oliver leapt down from the sill and wound himself around my ankles, demanding attention, purring, insisting that even small comforts could matter. I stroked his back, feeling the tension in my hands and shoulders begin to loosen slightly. But the relief was fleeting. Every sound, distant traffic, a neighbor's lawnmower, the clink of a dish made my pulse spike. I found myself counting steps, counting breaths, trying to impose order on a body that refused to calm. I moved to the kitchen, picking up a small notebook I had kept for years, filled with lists, reminders, and the occasional scribbled thought. Flipping through the pages, I read fragments of plans, little victories, and memories of Daniel's laughter. They grounded me, even if just for a moment. I thought about how fear had shaped my life in small increments, how it had crept into the very foundation of my home, my daily routines, my moments of solitude. By the time afternoon stretched into evening, the tension had settled into my bones. My movements were slow, deliberate, almost ritualistic, and yet I knew that nothing I did could completely stave off what was coming. The weight of anticipation of dread pressed against every thought. And still, in the quiet corners of my mind, there was a small ember of determination. Oliver jumped onto my lap again, purring insistently, and I let myself cradle him, drawing whatever comfort I could from the simple presence of his warmth. Even as the anxiety throbbed like a pulse in every muscle, I reminded myself that I had survived every storm so far. And tonight, I would need every ounce of that survival, every hard-won lesson in resilience, for what was about to unfold. The evening air had cooled slightly, carrying the scent of magnolia and the distant tang of the Savannah River. I was on the front porch, rocking gently in the wooden chair, trying to steady my thoughts, when Mrs. Calhoun shuffled up the steps. Her silver hair was pinned neatly, and her cardigan smelled faintly of lavender and mothballs. She stopped a few feet from me, eyes narrowing as if weighing how much to say. "Harriet." She began, her voice low and deliberate. "I saw Madison earlier today down by the corner market." She paused, looking away for a moment, then back. She was not herself, shouting at someone, waving her arms. She looked furious. My stomach tightened instantly. I forced my hands to unclench from the rocking chair's armrests. "Are you sure?" I asked, though I already knew. I had seen the glimmer in Madison's eyes during phone calls, the tension in her tone. But to hear it confirmed in the flesh was different. More real. "Yes, I'm sure," Mrs. Calhoun said. She hesitated, then added, "I thought you should know. Sometimes these things spill over. Be careful, Harriet." She didn't have to say more. I understood the unspoken warning perfectly. I nodded, trying to keep my voice steady. "Thank you, Mrs. Calhoun." "I appreciate it." She lingered for a moment, frowning slightly before turning and heading back toward her house. The sound of her heels against the brick sidewalk echoed in my chest longer than it should have. Inside, I closed the door slowly, leaning against it for a moment, as if the weight of the warning itself could pin me there. The apartment felt smaller now, the walls closing in the shadows stretching longer than usual. My mind raced through every possibility, imagining Madison's fury arriving at my door, uncontained, unstoppable. I walked to the living room and picked up my phone. For a brief moment, I thought about calling a friend, someone I trusted, who could check in or be nearby if things went wrong. Or a lawyer, perhaps someone who could remind Madison that I had rights, that threats alone carried consequences. My thumb hovered over the contacts list, hesitation, rooting me to the spot. The truth was uncomfortable. I had spent years managing alone, silently enduring, believing that relying on anyone else might make me seem weak. But tonight felt different. Tonight, the stakes were higher. Madison's fury was not abstract anymore. It had a body, a presence, and a momentum that I could not simply endure. Oliver jumped onto the couch, nudging my hand with his head, sensing my inner turmoil. I scratched behind his ears absently, trying to ground myself. I could feel the tension radiating from him, a quiet mirror to my own anxiety. The thought of Daniel, long grown, but always part of my heart, passed through me. I had protected him from so much. Perhaps it was time to protect myself, as deliberately. I considered options, weighing each with the precision of someone who had survived storms before. Call a friend for support alert, a lawyer for advice, set subtle traps, or rely entirely on my own preparation. Each choice carried consequences. Each one demanded courage I wasn't sure I could summon tonight. I set the phone down, exhaling slowly. The evening was drawing in, shadows pooling along the corners of the room. I knew that Madison's visit would come, and whether I chose allies or solitude, the moment of confrontation was approaching. Every heartbeat seemed to echo against the walls, a reminder that time was short and that preparation, patience, and courage were the only tools I had to face what was coming. The late afternoon sunlight slanted through the blinds, casting long stripes across the hardwood floor. I could hear it before I saw it, the faint crunch of tires on gravel, the confident rhythm of footsteps approaching my door. Madison. She had that unmistakable swagger, the way she moved through the world as though it belonged to her, loud and uncompromising, every step a declaration. The doorbell rang sharply, cutting through the quiet apartment like a knife. My chest tightened briefly, a familiar squeeze of anticipation and caution. I rose slowly, smoothing the front of my blouse, taking a deep breath to steady my hands. The apartment felt smaller somehow, the air heavier, every shadow more pronounced. When I opened the door, she was there just as I remembered, tall, perfectly coiffed, a slight smirk tugging at her lips. Her eyes scanned the apartment sharp and assessing, clearly expecting to find me anxious, flustered, or otherwise unprepared. She held herself with confidence, a subtle arrogance in the tilt of her chin. "Harriet," she said, voice carrying easily across the threshold. "I came as soon as I heard you'd been paid. You know why I'm here." I nodded, deliberately calm, letting my gaze meet hers evenly. I know I said my voice quiet, but firm. No tremor, no hesitation. She blinked, perhaps surprised that I wasn't retreating, that I didn't appear intimidated. Madison stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, letting her heels click against the floor, the sound echoing in my chest. She had a way of occupying a room, making it smaller for everyone else, and yet I stood my ground. My heart was racing under the surface, yes, but I had rehearsed this moment countless times. I would not show weakness. "Where's the money?" she asked, throwing the words into the room like a challenge. Her eyes searched mine, expecting to see fear. I stayed still, taking a slow step toward the counter, moving with the deliberate precision of someone who had learned to survive on careful calculation. I could hear my own breath steadying, and the faint hum of the refrigerator, the ticking of the wall clock, the subtle creak of the floorboards beneath my weight. Every detail anchored me, reminding me that I was present, alert, and in control. Madison's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second. I noticed it. She leaned against the doorway. Arms crossed, a picture of impatience and restrained frustration. "Don't waste my time, Harriet," she said, sharper now. The room seemed smaller, but I felt larger, somehow stretched by resolve and quiet determination. "Everything will be handled," I replied evenly, letting the words carry authority. No apology, no hesitation, only measured certainty. For a moment she studied me, her confident stance wavering just enough to suggest that she had not anticipated this. I could see the calculation behind her eyes, the flicker of doubt she tried to hide. This night was unfolding differently than she expected, and I allowed myself a small, imperceptible satisfaction at that realization. She let out a sharp exhale, as if testing the air between us before stepping further into the apartment. I maintained my calm, letting the silence stretch, giving her room to adjust to the fact that I was not powerless, that this encounter was no longer in her control alone. The shadows deepened across the floor as we faced each other in that quiet living room, the air thick with tension and unspoken threats. For the first time in years, I could see that Madison might not have the upper hand. And as I stood there, poised and resolute, I understood that tonight had the potential to change everything. Madison's gaze swept the room as she stepped further inside, heels clicking against the hardwood floor, each sound loud and deliberate. I kept my expression calm, letting her believe she was in control, while my mind cataloged every detail, every movement, every possible advantage. The living room looked ordinary, neatly arranged, cozy, but beneath the surface, I had layered quiet defenses. I moved slowly to the counter, letting my fingers brush over a small stack of papers I had intentionally left visible. Bank documents, insurance statements, and a copy of the powers of attorney I had prepared years ago lay just within reach, enough for her to notice if she looked carefully. Her eyes flickered briefly toward them, a micro-expression that almost betrayed recognition. I didn't react, only smiled faintly and poured myself a glass of water, letting the mundane action underscore my composure. Behind the subtle display, other measures were in place. I had called Officer Rivera earlier that afternoon, a neighbor and friend who understood the tension with Madison. She was scheduled to check in later tonight, but the knowledge that backup existed, that someone outside these walls was aware, gave me a steadiness I hadn't felt in years. I could feel it in the line of my shoulders, in the quiet lift of my chin. Madison shifted her weight, crossing her arms. Her tone was sharper now, demanding. "I want the money, Harriet. Don't make this difficult." I lifted my eyes to meet hers evenly, letting her words hang in the air without a tremor of fear. "Everything will be handled," I said softly, deliberately, leaving the implication vague, letting the weight of uncertainty settle on her. I could see her considering my words, trying to gauge whether I truly had nothing prepared or if I was bluffing. In moments like this, subtlety was my ally. I didn't need to reveal the entire strategy, only enough to suggest that I was no longer the timid, reactive woman she had controlled in the past. The hint of hidden support, carefully placed documents, and the unspoken presence of allies in the background was all I required to unsettle her. Oliver, sensing the tension, brushed against my ankles, tail flicking in soft agitation. I bent slightly to stroke him, letting the action appear casual, an innocent gesture, while reinforcing to myself that every small anchor mattered. My breathing remained steady, controlled. Each inhale and exhale reminded me that I had prepared, that I had thought this through, and that my strength was quiet but real. Madison's eyes narrowed slightly. She had expected fierce submission and perhaps a rush to comply. Instead, she was met with an unyielding presence, deliberate movements, and a calm that carried authority without aggression. It was a silent communication that I was no longer vulnerable, that this encounter was no longer hers to dominate entirely. I sipped my water slowly, glancing at her casually, noting the slight tension in her shoulders and the way her jaw tightened. She was calculating, searching for cracks, trying to measure my limits. But every subtle measure I had set the papers on the counter, the knowledge of allies. The quiet rhythm of my composure was like a shield I had woven over years of cautious preparation. As Madison exhaled sharply, frustration barely contained, I knew that the balance had shifted. This night would test every ounce of patience, every careful calculation, every silent strength I had accumulated. And in this tension, I found a measure of power, the kind that comes from knowing you have more than you appear to. Madison leaned against the counter, one hip cocked, eyes sharp and calculating. Her fingers drummed impatiently against the granite surface as she assessed me, clearly expecting hesitation, fear, or at least a flicker of doubt. She opened her mouth and the words came out, fast-clipped and cold. "Harriet, this isn't a game. You know why I'm here? Don't even think about stalling." I kept my gaze level, letting the tension hang in the air. "I understand why you're upset," I said evenly, voice calm, measured. I watched as her eyes narrowed, searching for any sign that my calm was a facade. Madison had always believed that my fear was the tool that kept her in control. Tonight, I would not hand it to her. "You understand," she said, incredulous, her tone rising slightly. "Do you think that's enough? Do you think I'll just leave with words I could?" She cut off abruptly, shaking her head, and her gaze flicked toward the papers on the counter. That small glance did not go unnoticed by me. It was a reminder that subtle cues could speak louder than 1,000 protests. I shifted slightly, reaching for a glass of water with deliberate slowness, allowing her to absorb my composure. "I've been careful with every decision, Madison. Everything is accounted for," I said, letting the words linger. My calmness was a counterweight to her aggression, a mirror reflecting her frustration rather than absorbing it. Her lips pressed into a thin line, and she stepped closer, the click of her heels sharp in the otherwise silent apartment. "You think this changes anything? That just because you hide behind documents or phone calls, I'm going to back down?" Her eyes flickered with a dangerous glint, a mixture of anger and disbelief. I didn't flinch. "No," I said, softly but firmly. "I don't expect you to back down, but I do expect that threats alone will no longer dictate my actions." The words were quiet, yet heavy, each one deliberate. I could feel the shift, subtle but undeniable, in the space between us. The balance of power was no longer hers to take for granted. Madison exhaled sharply, frustration pressing against the thin veneer of her control. "You've changed," she said almost to herself. "You've grown bold in ways I didn't expect." She paused, searching my face, trying to read hidden intentions, trying to find the cracks she knew were there. I met her stare directly. It took time, I admitted, and necessity. There was no apology, no trembling concession, only the quiet authority of someone who had endured years of pressure and had learned precisely how to respond. I could see the uncertainty ripple through her, the almost imperceptible hesitation in her posture. For the first time in years, I felt the full weight of the psychological duel we had always been engaged in, stretching across phone calls, stolen moments, and subtle manipulations. Tonight, it was laid bare in this living room, and the rules had changed. My calm was not weakness, and my composure was not submission. It was a shield and a statement. Madison's gaze flicked once more to the documents, then back to me. The battle was far from over, but the tension was no longer one-sided. In this quiet standoff, I felt something that had been buried beneath years of fierce certainty. I would not crumble under her pressure, not tonight. The air between us vibrated with anticipation, each small gesture, each measured word a calculated step in a dance neither of us could yet predict. And in that space, I understood the truth I had rehearsed for years. I could hold my ground even against the storm that Madison embodied. Madison's eyes narrowed as she stepped fully into the living room, scanning the space with practiced scrutiny. Every corner, every table, every shadow seemed to betray her, though nothing obvious met her gaze. She paused near the counter, letting her weight rest against it, then tilted her head slightly, her sharp eyes flicking toward the stack of papers I had left subtly in view. "I thought you'd be shaking by now," she said, her voice carrying a mixture of disbelief and accusation. "I thought I'd have this over in minutes." I stayed still, hands folded lightly in front of me, letting the silence stretch. My breathing was calm, measured a quiet anchor in the storm of tension. Madison's confident smirk faltered slightly, the micro-expression too fast to hide. She could sense something she hadn't accounted for, though she didn't yet know what. Her eyes darted around again, and that's when I noticed it. Her gaze lingering for a fraction too long on the small black device perched atop the bookshelf, the lens angled just so. A security camera. She hadn't expected that. A subtle layer of preparation, a quiet safeguard, but enough to shift the air between us. Madison's hand tightened on the counter, her nails pressing into the polished surface. You set this up?" Her voice trembled slightly, betraying the surprise she tried to mask. I met her stare evenly, letting my composure convey the answer she didn't want to hear. "It's just a precaution," I said softly. "I think we both know how quickly things can escalate." Her eyes flicked again, this time toward the doorway leading to the dining area. I had positioned a friend of mine, Lena, just out of direct sight, seated with calm authority, phone in hand, ready to call for assistance if needed. Another unseen witness, another subtle layer of safety. Madison's gaze lingered on that corner longer than was necessary. Her smirk gone, replaced by a flicker of hesitation. I could see the gears turning behind her eyes. Rapid calculations, each possibility she hadn't foreseen. Her confidence had been absolute when she arrived, but now the narrative had changed. I wasn't alone, and the room, though seemingly ordinary, had been subtly fortified with measures she didn't anticipate. "I didn't think," she began, but words failed her. Her hands flexed at her sides, restless, betraying tension she couldn't fully contain. Her stance faltered, just enough that I could sense the shift, the imbalance in the psychological duel we had waged for so long. I took a deliberate step forward, slow, measured, letting the silence work in my favor. The air felt heavier, charged, every movement magnified. Madison's quick breaths, the faint creak of the floorboards beneath her shoes, the distant hum of traffic outside, all seemed amplified, an orchestra accompanying the subtle reversal of power in the room. Her eyes met mine again, searching for weakness, for a crack, for any sign that this unexpected preparation had unsettled me. She found none. My calm was a statement, my posture a shield, and my gaze a quiet challenge, I was ready. Madison's lips pressed into a thin line, a mixture of frustration and disbelief etched across her features. The shift was subtle, almost imperceptible to anyone else, but in that moment, I knew it was complete. The first shock had landed. The room, though unchanged in furniture or layout, had transformed in tension. The invisible layers, hidden eyes, unseen allies, subtle signals had rewritten the script. For the first time, Madison's certainty wavered, and I could feel the tiniest spark of satisfaction, knowing that tonight the story was no longer hers to control. The room was thick with tension, the air heavy and almost tangible. Madison stood by the counter, arms crossed her jaw, tight, clearly frustrated by the subtle shifts she could not control. I took a slow, deliberate breath, letting the silence stretch long enough that she grew restless. Every inch of my posture, every measured movement, was a statement I would not be hurried, bullied, or coerced. "I'm listening," I said quietly, deliberately, as though weighing her next words against invisible scales. My voice carried no tremor, no urgency, only calm authority. Madison's eyes flicked at me, searching for hesitation, a sign that I might yield. She found none. "You don't get it," she snapped. Stepping closer, the sharp click of her heels against the hardwood echoing with authority she had long relied on. "This isn't a negotiation. You give me what's owed now, or—" She stopped mid-sentence, faltering slightly, as she realized I wasn't reacting with the panic she expected. "I've considered everything I said." My tone steady, measured, as I moved toward the center of the room. "And what you're asking, threats, intimidation, demands for money will not happen tonight. Or any night. Not under my roof." The words hung between us, simple, unwavering, and weighted with more power than I could have imagined before this moment. Madison's smirk wavered. The confident air she had carried into the apartment seemed thinner, the sharpness of her voice less assured. "You think you can just—" She started again, but the words lacked conviction. Something in her stance faltered, a subtle shift in balance. Her power, so absolute when she first arrived, was cracking. I took a slow step closer, letting my gaze meet hers squarely. "I am not the person I was when you first learned how to control me. That woman, silent, fearful, she is no longer here. And the threats that once worked the intimidation you depended on, they will not work again." She froze, her eyes flicking to the documents on the counter, to the hidden camera, to the quiet presence of Lena, just beyond her line of sight. The pieces of her carefully rehearsed strategy, which she had assumed would give her dominance, were unraveling, and I watched the realization cross her face. This was no longer the same script she had memorized, no longer the same moment she had rehearsed in her mind. I don't understand," she said, voice trembling slightly, though she tried to mask it with a sharp edge. "Why now? Why are you like this?" Because I had learned, I thought silently. Because years of silent endurance had forged a strength she could no longer ignore. Because it's time, I replied simply. It's time that boundaries exist. It's time that respect replaces fear. Her shoulders slumped minutely, frustration mixed with disbelief and perhaps the tiniest hint of respect. I could sense the shift, subtle but undeniable, in the room's energy. Madison had expected compliance, submission, and panic. Instead, she met composure, quiet authority, and an unyielding refusal to yield. The conversation had changed the room, not with shouting, not with threats, but with measured words, calm presence, and the assertion of limits. I could see her power crumbling piece by piece, and I felt the first real surge of control I had experienced in years. I moved back toward the counter, letting my hands rest lightly on its surface, still meeting her gaze. The tension remained, but it was no longer weighted solely by her aggression. It was a balance now, one in which I could finally measure my own strength and stake my claim to it. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, I knew that a single conversation, deliberate and unwavering, could redefine everything between us. The air between us had thickened, charged with tension that felt almost electric. Madison's breathing had grown quicker, shallow, her gaze sharp and restless, as she circled the room like a predator seeking an opening. I stayed rooted in place, calm on the surface, though my pulse thudded against my ribs with the memory of every threat she had ever made. "You think you can just stand there and talk?" she snapped, her voice rising sharp and brittle. Her hand swept across the counter in a gesture of irritation, sending a stack of coasters tumbling to the floor. "Do you even realize what you've done to me, Harriet?" I let the clatter fall, lifting my eyes steadily to hers. "I do," I said evenly, voice firm, but not raised. "And I've considered every possibility tonight. I am not afraid." Madison's lips pressed into a thin line, her jaw tight with frustration. But the facade of control was cracking. She moved closer, swiping a vase from the side table with a sharp motion, and it crashed against the wall, shattering in a spray of ceramic fragments. The shards clinked and scattered across the hardwood, a sudden explosion of sound that made my stomach lurch. "You never listened before, and you won't listen now," she said, her words spilling like hot sparks. Her eyes were wide pupils dilated as she scanned my face for signs of flinching. She was looking for weakness, a crack in my composure she could exploit, and I met her gaze evenly, refusing to give her the satisfaction. The room felt impossibly small now, the air dense with anger and adrenaline. Oliver darted between our legs, tail-puffed ears flat, a quiet alarm to the storm brewing around us. I reached down, scooping him up with one hand, letting him press against my chest. The small weight grounded me, a tactile reminder that calm could exist even in chaos. Madison's voice rose again, nearly a shout. "You think you're untouchable, don't you? That nothing I do can affect you." She stomped toward the counter, narrowly missing the edge of the scattered vase shards, then pivoted sharply to face me, hands trembling with anger. "I am prepared," I said, voice soft but unwavering. "Everything here is accounted for. Threats will not force my hand." My words were deliberate, each syllable carrying authority and the quiet weight of someone who had survived worse storms. For a moment, she froze, her chest heaving, and I could see the calculation flicker behind her eyes. She had expected panic, fear, submission, but she found none. The aggression that had fueled her confidence began to falter, a subtle hesitation creeping into her posture, though her expression still screamed defiance. Then, in a sudden motion of frustration, she swiped a stack of books from the coffee table, sending them clattering across the floor. The sound was sharp, a punctuation mark in the crescendo of her rage. My heart jumped at the near miss of flying objects, but I did not retreat. I took another deliberate step forward, meeting her energy with calm authority rather than reactionary fear. The tension was now almost physical, a palpable force pressing against the walls, squeezing the air. Madison's eyes flicked toward the corners of the room, noting the subtle cues I had left, the hidden camera lens glinting faintly in the lamplight, the presence of Lena just out of sight, phone in hand. Her realization hit her in a slow electric shock. Her dominance was no longer absolute. She exhaled sharply, a mix of frustration and disbelief, and I sensed the tipping point approaching. The room felt ready to shatter, like an overcharged wire about to snap. Madison's fury had reached its peak, and the question hung between us, heavy and unspoken. Would she cross a line she could not undo, or would restraint finally temper the storm she had unleashed? I stood my ground, steady and calm. the weight of years of preparation pressing against every muscle. The confrontation had escalated to its near physical limit, and every moment from here forward would define not only the night, but the balance of power between us. The room had grown tense, thick with the sharp tang of fear and anticipation. Madison's chest rose and fell rapidly, her hands twitching, eyes darting around for leverage. She had come in expecting a timid, frightened woman, someone she could dominate and coerce with threats and aggression. But I was no longer that person. I took a slow step toward the counter, deliberately moving my hands over the neatly stacked papers. Legal documents, powers of attorney, and banking authorizations, all arranged so that anyone observant enough could see them. My preparation was visible, yet subtle, designed not to provoke, but to announce that the rules had changed. Madison's eyes flicked to the papers, widening almost imperceptibly. "You think this will intimidate me?" She spat, her voice sharp but uncertain. "Do you realize what you're risking, Harriet?" I met her gaze evenly, letting my calmness answer her before words ever needed to leave my lips. Then I gestured toward the door where I knew my friend Lena waited just out of sight. Her phone, ready eyes scanning and alert. "I've taken precautions," I said softly, each syllable deliberate. "Everything tonight is accounted for." Madison's smirk faltered, replaced by a flicker of hesitation. Her confidence, so absolute just moments ago, was trembling. She took a step back, her gaze shifting to the small black camera perched atop the bookshelf. The lens glinted faintly in the overhead light, a silent witness to the unfolding scene. She hadn't expected surveillance, hadn't anticipated that I had thought 3 steps ahead. You set all this up?" Her voice cracked slightly, betraying the shock she tried to mask with bravado. I didn't respond immediately, letting the silence stretch and settle. Each tick of the clock, each shallow breath Madison drew, amplified the imbalance. Then I spoke, calm, measured, and firm. "Yes, I have prepared for tonight for every possibility. You assumed I would react as before, that fear would guide me. It will not. Not anymore." Her eyes darted back toward the papers, the camera, the shadow near the doorway. Every layer of preparation I had embedded the legal documents, the watchful neighbor, the knowledge that local authorities had been alerted was visible to her, now a network she had never accounted for. Her face paled, her lips pressing into a thin line. The storm she had brought into my home was hitting walls she hadn't imagined. I don't," Madison began, but her words faltered. The certainty she had carried and the arrogance that allowed her to believe she could dominate me was cracking under the weight of reality. She scanned the room again, seeking escape leverage, some shred of control, and found none. I took another step closer, deliberate and calm, letting the rhythm of my composure reinforce the message. "Tonight is not about fear or compliance," I said softly. "It is about boundaries, preparation, and respect. You assumed I would remain vulnerable. You assumed incorrectly." The color drained from her face as the realization sank in the woman she had come to intimidate was not only prepared, but supported, anchored by allies' evidence and foresight. The balance of power had shifted entirely, and she could see it now, however, unwillingly. A quiet hum of tension filled the room. Madison's fists clenched, then relaxed slightly, uncertainty overtaking her aggression. She stepped back, hesitating, unable to decide whether to push forward or retreat. And in that instant, I understood something crucial. This was no longer just a confrontation. It was a declaration. Every paper, every subtle presence in the room, every quiet layer of preparation spoke louder than words. The room's energy shifted, no longer weighted solely by her fury, but balanced by the calm, deliberate authority I projected. For the first time in years, she had no leverage, no dominance, no certainty. Her lips parted, and she exhaled sharply, a brief acknowledgement of the unseen structure she had overlooked. And in that moment, I realized the truth I had rehearsed for months. She had not expected me to be ready. And the revelation of that readiness changed everything. The sound of footsteps outside the apartment door froze Madison in place for a fraction of a second. The quiet rhythm of anticipation she had carried with her into the living room was interrupted, and for the first time, uncertainty crept into her movements. The soft click of a lock, turning the faint murmur of a voice, and the unmistakable presence of authority in the building shattered the illusion of control she had clung to. I watched her, carefully eyes steady as Madison hesitated, glancing toward the windows and the subtle shadows where Lena had positioned herself. The tension in the room had shifted a tangible current, flowing between us, balanced now by her awareness of consequences she could no longer ignore. Without a word, she pivoted, heels scraping against the hardwood, and strode to the door, hands trembling slightly. The moment she exited, relief rushed through me like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. I exhaled, letting the tension drain slowly from my shoulders, and sank into the chair by the counter, still holding Oliver close. His fur pressed warmly against my chest, a quiet comfort, as the adrenaline in my veins began to ebb. It had been years since I felt this simple, unguarded relief. This was more than a fleeting pause. It was a sensation of safety, of space reclaimed, of a home no longer dominated by fear. I glanced at the papers on the counter, the legal documents, the records, the subtle reminders of preparation that had given me the edge. They were no longer symbols of anxiety, but instruments of power I had learned to wield. Every careful arrangement, every precaution had been validated in the way Madison's authority faltered and finally receded. Lena emerged from her quiet position. Phone now lowered her expression, calm but alert. "All clear," she said softly, a small smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "She's gone, and no one was hurt." I nodded, swallowing the lump that had lodged in my throat during the confrontation. It was a strange sensation, this mixture of lingering tension and sudden freedom. I moved slowly through the apartment, checking that the locks were secure, the documents safely tucked away, the hidden camera still silently recording. Each action felt deliberate, a continuation of the careful vigilance that had become my second nature. But beneath it all, there was a lightness I hadn't experienced in years. The threat was no longer immediate, and I could breathe without calculating every potential risk. The shards of the vase from earlier in the confrontation still glittered faintly on the floor, a small testament to the intensity of the encounter. Yet they seemed distant now, almost unreal. I bent to pick up a few, mindful of my own safety, and realized that the emotional weight of fear, anticipation, and tension had lessened. The apartment, once constricting and oppressive, now felt expansive in a way I hadn't noticed in a long time. Oliver leapt onto the counter, nudging my hand with his head, a silent companion in the stillness that followed. I stroked him slowly, feeling the pulse of calm that extended through the apartment. It wasn't just relief, it was a small, almost sacred acknowledgement that I had endured, that I had survived, and that for the first time in years I could allow myself to exist in this space without constant vigilance. I sank back into the chair, fully letting the quiet settle around me, the tension of the last hours giving way to the first true sense of security I had felt in ages. The confrontation was over. The threat had passed. And for the first time in as long as I could remember, safety felt not like a temporary state, but something I might actually hold on to. Even as the sun dipped lower outside the windows, casting long shadows across the hardwood floor, a fragile sense of peace settled within me. The immediate danger had passed, and the first ripple of something deeper began to grow. Trust in myself, trust in the space I had fought to reclaim, and trust that the night's victory was real, not fleeting. The apartment was quiet now. The tension that had gripped every corner and shadow lifted, leaving only the soft hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the old floorboards. I sat in my chair. Oliver curled at my feet and allowed myself the luxury of stillness. It was a strange sensation, one I hadn't felt in years, peace fragile, but undeniable, settling over me like sunlight after a storm. I thought back over the years, tracing the long line of moments where fear had guided my steps. The late nights pacing the apartment, listening for every sound that could indicate trouble. The careful calculations about when and how to answer phone calls. The constant vigilance over every interaction, every word spoken, every opportunity for my life to be disrupted by someone else's demands. Those years had been heavy, and yet they had forged something inside me, resilience I hadn't realized I possessed. I remembered the quiet victories too. Each time I had met a threat with composure, each time I had navigated Madison's manipulations without collapsing, I had survived. I had survived when no one else noticed, when no one applauded. My strength had been invisible, subtle, woven into the everyday routines that kept both Daniel and me safe. And now, for the first time in a long time, I could see that strength reflected back at me. I traced my fingers over the counter where the papers still lay, the legal documents that had served as both shield and statement. They were more than ink on paper. They were the physical embodiment of years of thought, preparation, and endurance. Each one reminded me that my survival had been intentional, deliberate, and strategic. The woman I had been fearful and reactive was gone. In her place stood someone who had learned to wield patience, foresight, and courage as tools, not just shields. The shattering of the vase, the escalation of threats, the silent presence of allies, they had all been necessary tests, and I had passed. But the deeper victory, the one that mattered most, was internal. The fear that had once dictated my actions no longer had that power. I could feel it, still a faint echo in the chest, but it was tempered now by awareness, by knowledge that I had endured far more than this one night. Oliver nudged my hand, breaking my reverie, and I stroked him gently. Even in these small, mundane gestures, there was healing. I realized that resilience wasn't only about standing up to others. It was about tending to oneself, allowing quiet moments of recognition and relief to exist alongside vigilance. I could sit here in this stillness and honor both the fear and the strength that had carried me this far. The room was bathed in the soft glow of the evening sun, shadows stretching across the hardwood, yet they no longer felt threatening. They were markers of survival, reminders of the battles endured and the courage cultivated. I could forgive myself for the years of doubt and fear, even as I vowed never to surrender my autonomy again. Each breath was deliberate, each heartbeat, a quiet assertion that I had arrived at a new place, one where control, dignity, and awareness lived side by side. I sat there for a long moment, feeling the weight of the past lift slightly with every inhale. The confrontation, the threat, the strategic preparation they had all brought me here. And in this calm, I understood that survival was not just about enduring danger. It was about reclaiming oneself from the years of pain and fear. For the first time in a long time, I allowed myself to feel the quiet swell of pride. I had endured, I had acted, and I had protected not only my life, but the integrity of my home and my boundaries. The journey of healing had begun, subtle and steady, and I could sense that the resilience I had built would carry me forward into whatever came next. The next morning, sunlight spilled across the hardwood floors, warm and steady, carrying a quiet reassurance I hadn't realized I needed. I had spent the night in a rare, unbroken sleep, my body finally releasing the tension that had gripped it for hours, for years. Oliver stretched beside me, blinking slowly, his small presence grounding me in the calm after the storm. The doorbell rang a sound that would once have sent my heart racing. But this time, I walked to the door with steady steps, letting the anticipation mix with a quiet sense of purpose rather than fear. There, on the threshold, was Marina, my daughter, grown and changed, yet immediately recognizable. Her eyes held a mixture of cautious hope and restrained joy, her arms cradling a small bundle wrapped in a soft blanket. "Hi, Mom," she said, voice gentle but firm. I hesitated only a moment before stepping aside to let her in the years of distance and silence stretching between us like a fragile bridge. She set the bundle down carefully on the sofa and pulled back the blanket to reveal Violeta, my granddaughter, asleep with a tiny hand curling around the edge of her mother's cardigan. The sight made something in my chest loosen memories of Daniel as a child mingling with this new, unexpected joy. "Hi?" I whispered, voice catching slightly, and she smiled, the tension in her shoulders softening as she saw my reaction. For a long moment, none of us spoke. The quiet was not uncomfortable. It was a gentle acknowledgement of the space we had all crossed to arrive here. Marina gestured toward the small kitchen table. "I thought we could have breakfast together," she said. "Nothing fancy, just us." I nodded, feeling a strange mix of gratitude and relief. As we settled, Oliver jumping onto the chair beside Violeta, the room began to fill with ordinary warmth. The hum of conversation, the clinking of dishes, and the faint aroma of coffee that reminded me of countless mornings I had shared with Daniel when he was small. Marina spoke softly about her life, her work, and the moments she had tried to reach out over the years. Messages and calls intercepted opportunities missed. Listening to her, I realized how much misunderstanding and external influence had shaped the gap between us. I felt a rush of sorrow for lost time, but also an undercurrent of hope. This was the first step toward rebuilding trust, one careful word and gesture at a time. Violeta stirred, opening her eyes and blinking at me. I held out my hand slowly, and she reached for me, small fingers curling around mine. The connection was immediate, a tangible bond that transcended the years of absence and hurt. I felt tears prick at the edges of my eyes, not from fear or anxiety, but from a quiet, deep-seated relief that this bridge so long neglected could begin to hold weight again. Later, we sat together on the sofa, Marina sharing photos of Violeta's early months, the milestones I had missed. I listened, asked questions, laughed softly at the little quirks and achievements, and in doing so, allowed the walls of solitude and caution I had built to loosen, just a bit. Even Oliver, now sprawled across my lap, seemed to sense the shift curling in closer, as if to approve of the peace settling into the room. By the time the morning light softened into mid-morning, I realized something profound. The rebuilding of trust wasn't instantaneous, nor was it easy. But the act of sitting together, speaking openly, and letting the small moments of connection grow had begun the process. I could see it in Marina's eyes, in Violeta's innocent gaze, and in the quiet, steady rhythm of our shared presence. For the first time in years, I felt the possibility of a family restored, not perfect, not unbroken, but present, attentive, and willing to nurture the bonds that had been strained for too long. And in that presence, I found a warmth that no fear, no threat, and no betrayal could take away. The sunlight spilled across the dining room, warm and golden, casting gentle shadows over the table set for a simple meal. Plates gleamed silverware, arranged with care, and a small vase of fresh flowers brightened the center. For the first time in what felt like years, the table was mine fully and completely, without fear or obligation hovering in the corners. Marina poured coffee, moving with quiet familiarity, while Violeta giggled as she carefully placed napkins at each setting. Oliver stretched lazily on the rug, his purrs a soft accompaniment to the gentle hum of conversation. I settled into my chair, hands resting lightly on the table, feeling the weight of tension finally lift. We spoke softly, sharing stories and laughter. The echoes of the past replaced by a calm rhythm that felt almost foreign. Madison's absence was a relief rather than a void. Her threats and aggression no longer shaped the space. I had reclaimed it, and with it, a sense of empowerment that had been long denied. I watched Marina as she laughed at Violeta's little jokes, noting the familiar gestures, the inherited expressions that reminded me of Daniel as a child. Each small connection, each shared smile was a thread, weaving the fabric of a family restored. I felt it in the quiet pauses, in the gentle exchanges, in the way Violeta reached for my hand without hesitation. The bonds we had rebuilt, tentative yet real, filled the room more completely than any decoration could. The sunlight caught on the flowers again, highlighting their vibrancy, a subtle reminder that life continues, that joy and peace can exist even after long periods of fear. I took a deep breath, savoring it, feeling the calm settle fully into my bones. The house felt lighter, the air freer, and for the first time, I allowed myself to simply exist in the moment without calculation or caution. This was more than a meal. It was a declaration, a quiet affirmation that the years of endurance, preparation, and courage had not been in vain. I could sit here, empowered and unafraid, surrounded by family who were present, attentive and supportive. The sense of peace was real, earned, and finally deserved. As we shared breakfast, laughter, and conversation, I realized the weight of what had changed. The table, once a place of tension and threat, had become a sanctuary, a space where love, safety, and empowerment coexisted. For the first time in years, I felt complete.